Hi, folks. I'm recording this on Tuesday, the night of the debate, and I'm sure we're all engaged in virus stuff, in debate stuff, in US stuff. And so I thought I would talk about something totally different and how all of this plays itself out in Africa. There's also a lot going on in Russia, Belarus, and so forth. I'll talk about that down the road somewhere. But Africa is not as irrelevant to all the things we're worried about as one would imagine. We keep on being told, right, that we are only 4% of the world's population. And so it behooves us to find out what's going on elsewhere. And Africa is super interesting in terms of the virus. As you know, there are over 1 billion people who live there, and there are over 50 countries. And while it's true that different countries have different policies and also have different virus experiences now, or COVID, I'm not going to talk about individual countries, but rather what, in a sense, Africa tells us about A, the virus, and B, the economic impact of the virus outside the United States. So first about the virus. It is surprising to everybody, the World Health Organization, everybody else, that so far at least, the outbreak or the percentage of people infected with COVID is rather low in Africa. In fact, it seems lowest on that continent, much lower than in Latin America and Europe, with the exception, of course, in East Asia and China, which seems to, at the moment in any event, seems to have conquered the outbreak. But if you compare, for example, Latin America with Africa, Latin America has a lot of COVID, and Africa seems to have relatively little. And the question is, what's the explanation? And the various explanations currently are vaguely interesting. First of all, part of the explanation is that the population is very young. The median age on the African continent is 18 years. That is incredibly young. I mean, in most European countries, the median age is high 30s, 40s, 50s. In the United States, it's 39. In Russia, it's 40. In Belgium, it's 41, and so forth. So the median age being 17 and 18 years old, somewhere in between, is the youngest population, or cumulatively the youngest population everywhere. And as we've learned, while it is true that children get the virus and can even spread it, and we are very sensitive to that right now in terms of school opening, it is also the case that the number of children, percentage-wise, who have gotten it in the heavy-duty COVID outbreak countries, as well as the number of deaths amongst children, seems to be percentage-wise lower than adults and older adults. Now, we already know that older adults are more liable to die from it than somewhat younger adults by and large. But still, children, the death rate amongst children, mercifully, is very low. So one of the explanations in the African continent might be that the reason the outbreak, or at least those that are positive and known to get sick, because of course there's relatively little testing going on, are of a very young age, and that is fairly interesting. The other thing is, that's even in some ways more remarkable, is that because of the Ebola and other health circumstances on the African continent, many African countries actually are better placed with dealing with a pandemic than many Western countries, certainly Latin American countries, and even the US. The Ebola outbreak and dealing with it and learning how to operate the public health system in various countries is proportionally very much stronger. And many people in the public health sector on the African continent are much more experienced than people dealing with a plague, and dealing with the plague under African circumstances. And so remarkably, some of the earliest interventions, which were sensible, happened in African countries, Uganda, Rwanda, Malawi, Ghana, all kinds of places. While we were, if we meaning the United States and other European countries, were flailing about and couldn't coordinate very much of anything, Africans were rather good at it, which goes counter to one's imagination. Nothing works in Africa as well as it does in other parts of the world. Then in addition to that, of course, many people in Africa live outside. Now, it's true that higher and higher percentage, close to 60% in some countries, have moved from the countryside into urban areas. So it's not that everybody lives in rural areas, but many people live in rural areas. And even people in urban areas in Africa very often spend a fair amount of their time outside. They have small houses or huts or very dilapidated housing, but they spend it, outside. And, we know that, we all have running water. We can wash our hands. We're not often very obedient about it. But what do people do in poor countries where there is no running water? Well, because of Ebola and other things, they developed these cheap water stations where you pump water at the end of a road or the end of a settlement. And the governments often provide soap so that people actually are in a position to do some hand washing, not as much as we can or we should, but still there's more sort of sanitation going on than one would imagine. So in a remarkable way, even though the most developed of African countries, South Africa, has the worst problem, probably because of the urbanization and also bad political management, the continent as a whole statistically is doing incredibly well so far. And I'm in no position to say that that's not going to change, but it's quite remarkable. But even so, even with fairly low outbreaks, the economic impact has been really quite dire, because most of these economies are very poor to begin with. But with the COVID outbreak, schools have closed in those countries, right? And many of the economic trades with the industrial world and so forth have slowed down or come to a grinding halt because of the economic downturn in the rest of the world. So the economies of African countries, for various internal and external reasons, have been very badly hit. And that will have very long-term implications for the African continent. It is generally, in the developed assistance world, it is generally thought that the COVID virus, even though it has not been as prominent as it has in the rest of the world, will set Africa back anywhere between 10, depending on whose estimate, 20 years in terms of its economic development. That, by the way, is also an argument made about India, which I might say a few words about. And why is that? Well, because Africa was at the cusp of really improving its economies. You had more urbanization, you had business growing, you had the development of a middle class, you had increasing numbers of children attending at least some schooling. Okay, so the schools close, the parents can't make a living anymore. Even where the schools might be open, they can't afford school fees. What happens? Well, one of the things that's really dreadful that happens is that you send your children out to beg. And girls are being sent out as sex workers, and boys are being sent out to beg, right? So in many of the countries, the girls are now roaming around selling their bodies and, among other things, getting pregnant. And among other reasons, of course, pregnancy increases the population, increases problems with giving birth. So the public health aspect having to do with pregnancies and population increase and teenagers having babies has been badly exacerbated because of the economic impact of COVID. The other aspect is that most of the children who are dropping out of school will never return to school. Now, we in the United States also think that the missing of school will set back the education, especially in poor communities where the kids may never catch up educationally and therefore may not graduate high school and certainly not go to college. So we too are worried about that. But on the African continent, the worry is not simply because are people going to move into secondary and university. The worry is that people will permanently have dropped out of elementary school, which means that their economic prospects in the future and the burden of having so many impoverished, unskilled people in the society will be a long-term burden in the economic development of those countries. Now, that's a very serious current problem, but it's even a more serious long-term problem. And the question is, can anything be done about it? Well, not much. That is to say, the governments do not have monies to subsidize the education of children or to keep them in school or to give some kind of economic benefits to unemployed people who used to be unemployed. Many people in rural areas were already somewhat underemployed, and now their capacity to earn anything is radically reduced. So that the whole situation, which we notice in our own country and in other countries, that there is an economic decline and unemployment, we think in industrial countries, in a few years, we'll be able to catch up. And development experts believe that on the African continent, this is not a matter of 2 or 3 years of catching up. This is a matter of a decade or more being lost in the development of a continent, which in many ways was beginning to take off by, as I said, developing a middle class, developing industrial capacities, benefiting from the technology that is available, and so on. So while the short-term issues on the African continent may be very positive, the long-term issues, even at the current rate, not to mention that the rate of sickness and death might increase in the next year or two before there's a virus, is a very serious problem of health and public health, but also development and development strategy for the least developed continent as a whole that exists. Now, I mentioned the infrastructure, the health infrastructure that was developed over AIDS and SARS and so forth. And I want to return to that for a moment because contrary to what one imagines, the African continent also has a continental CDC. It is located in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. It's part of the African Union. It has been funded internationally, and believe it or not, it actually has some reasonable capacity. And it in turn links with national CDCs, or at least national public health structures, so that there is a network that is on the continent that actually functions potentially reasonably well, especially with outside assistance coming from the World Health Organization and others, as well as public funding. Now here's the rub again, right? We've talked about this before. Public funding, international public funding has been reduced. Part of this is navel gazing. That is to say, each country is saying, we're so needy, we need to worry about ourselves. And part of it is strategy and tactics brought to the world by our wonderful administration, which has cut its contributions, well, we've even left, but cut its contributions to the World Health Organizations, UNICEF. There have been budget cuts to all kinds of international agencies, as well as budget cuts within our bilateral USAID and our contributions to, for example, the World Bank, the funding of special projects and so forth. So the de-internationalization of our policies, America first, and the hell with global and international institutions and other societies, has impacted the ability to operationalize the African CDC and national health mechanisms considerably. So what's left is, Doctors Without Borders, International Red Cross, and so forth, trying very urgently to get funds to help, first of all, to make sure to keep battening down the number of outbreaks, but also to help each of the societies economically in some ways, so that the adversity of the disease does not become an economic adversity down the road. Well, you could still say, who the hell cares? Africa is far away. We don't much care about it. But as we already know, the African population will constitute somewhere between 20 and 25% of the world's population later this century. So we're not talking about, a few million here or there. We're talking about a substantial population in the world. And if we're talking about a substantial population not doing well, or not doing as well as they might have if one got handle and control of the virus and the economic downturn as we speak and in the next year, we will also see this spin-off into even worse circumstances in terms of climate change and its impact. Because as we have discussed before, the African continent is badly impacted by global warming and desertification. One of the reasons why there's such a rapid move into urban areas is because rural people can't make a living in the African continent because of desertification, not enough water, and so forth. So that leads people to go in the urban areas. As the urban areas are no longer flourishing, or some of them were at least flourishing to some extent in their economic growth in the last couple of years, 3 years, 4 years, you will get a desire to drift out of the continent, and therefore you augment the problem of emigration, and therefore the immigration issues and the pressures on the rest of the world of Africans wanting to move out of the African continent because they can't survive, they can't make a living, and they can't survive in terms of water shortages on the continent. So I guess what I'm saying here is that there is a domino effect here. You have the poorest continent in the world, by and large, dealing as in many ways better than some other countries, for example, India and Brazil, with the COVID outbreak. You have the fortuitous circumstance that the population is very young. You have a network of national health mechanisms that were developed and could quickly be put back into place based on Ebola and AIDS, and a fair amount of experience, not in every African countries, but in a fair number of African countries. You have all kinds of positives, right? But what you also have is economic spin-offs that are much more serious than they are in most parts of the world. Let me compare this for a moment to China, right? China has seemingly mastered the COVID outbreak, even though we keep blaming them for early onset and non-communications. And people thought, well, the Chinese economy is just going to slow down and they were going to have huge economic difficulties. Actually, the Chinese economy is doing quite well, and we can discuss that. And for those of you who went to Ben Reed's lecture last Sunday, he also talked about somewhat. But China's economic downturn has so far been prevented, and in fact, they have reasonable growth. So what about African countries? Could they quickly turn around to some reasonable growth, let's say in 2 years' time, if not in a year's time? And here I'm saying, and I know I'm repeating myself, the answer is probably no. And the answer is probably no is because the population will be undereducated. There will be, the birth rate will increase again. Birth control will not be accelerating in any any way for one reason or another. The move out of the countryside will continue to lead to urban expansion, but the urban expansion, which helped their economic prospects in the last few years, will be so slowed down that you will have more slums, more unemployed, more children begging, and so forth. So rather than urbanization being a signature for economic improvement, which in many ways has been the case in most African countries in the last few years, the urbanization will be out of sync with the economic decline, and both because of the COVID and because of its impact on education and training, and also because of climate change. And so the spin-offs in Africa will be somewhat different than the spin-offs in other parts of the world. So on the one hand, I'm painting a kind of, isn't it interesting how well Africa's doing picture? And on the other hand, I'm sort of saying gloom and doom down the road for the African continent, unless the world were to mobilize and undercut some of the very serious negative impacts that are going to visit the African continent. And unless US policy turns around, and unless Europe and all other countries get on board, for example, to rev up the Paris Agreement and rev up the contribution of the more affluent countries to the less affluent countries, let's say, for example, in Africa, unless there is more input in terms of education, unless there's lots of things, lots of aid, lots of assistance, lots of loans, lots of things which have slowed down and but had helped the African continent. The disaster on the African continent as a consequence of COVID may, in the medium term, be much more serious than the very rosy picture of, wow, look at Africa, it's not doing as badly as other countries. So let me just stop talking about Africa and add one other comment, and that is that all what we have know and understand so far about COVID everywhere in the world is that the capacity of the governments in countries seem to be a main variable. The countries that are governed well, that have leadership that centralizes announcements and policies, that doesn't screw around the way the United States has done, Britain, Brazil, and so forth, that those countries are able to handle COVID most effectively, and therefore also in the medium term, probably economically, will do the best. So the quality of government is a key variable here. It's not just the disease, it's not just economics, it's the quality of the government, its capacity. Now, you would think that most African governments have very bad governing capacity. They're mostly corrupt, they're mostly malfunctioning in one way or the other. And that is why international policy, as well as continental policy coming from the CDC in Addis Ababa, and other places, will play a very major role. And I would suspect that the African countries that will do relatively well, not just to continue to cope with COVID, but also to figure out ways that the economics and social life of the societies don't decline. That variable will be the capacity of the government. And why does one make that guess? Well, one makes that guess by looking at other countries, right? The East Asian countries, the few European countries that have done rather well, have done well because their governments took action, the actions were comprehensible, they listened to scientific advice, and so on. The odd thing here is that actually African governments do listen to scientific advice. And where did they learn that? Well, they learn it in a variety of ways, but they learn it through the Ebola crisis. So the public health and scientific advice aspect, there may not be very many doctors, there may not be fleshed out local public health systems, but there is a respect for science in most African countries. One final and short point, and that is that there is a lot of violence and conflict and jihadism in the Sahel, and that is an issue I will have to address some other time. But for the countries that are being undermined by civil conflict, Mali, Burkina Faso, all those countries up there, where military from various parts of the world are playing a role, and as a matter of fact, even Americans are there doing all kinds of stuff in trying to undercut terrorism and the French and jihadism. That part of the world is a real mess and will probably make it much more difficult for the countries that border the Sahel to get control of this. And finally, one stray African comment that has nothing to do with anything I've talked about today, really, and that is the Trump administration is trying to line up more countries to recognize Israel before the election. And one of the countries that the US government is putting a lot of pressure on is the Sudan. The Sudan is a very complex country with decades of civil war, and it's a big mess. And under, what does the US do in its bargain with all of these countries? It essentially says, you recognize Israel, will give you more arms. Very dangerous in that part of the world, very dangerous in a country that has been rife with civil conflict, and very dangerous given the location of the Sudan, which is, not so far away from the North African Sahel countries, which also have civil strife. So rather than helping the situation, pressuring a country like the Sudan in particular to recognize Israel before the election also will have a negative impact on the capacity of some countries to deal not only with COVID, but to deal with the economic stress that COVID and other things have brought them. Okay, well, see you in a couple of weeks. Hope you are doing reasonably well. Take care. Bye-bye.